they were getting paid by the byte or something. I don't know, but they definitely weren't so interested. The idea was if I collect a whole bunch of information, something in here has to be of value, and I don't want to spend the time or take the risk of really looking at this data too much. Just get it and get out. And similarly, there's this notion of grab and go, which by that we're kind of talking about bursty behavior, looking for windows of opportunity. The malicious group tended to be very bursty, grab things really quick when there's a window of opportunity, whereas the benign group would just be more steady state, kind of, they open a document, look at it, try to understand it, synthesize it, maybe go to the next document. The malicious people were just taking windows of opportunity quickly, gathering the information, and then maybe there would be a lull, and then there'd be another burst over time. We saw that both with what they downloaded and what they searched on. One of the interesting things that we did was we actually searched, we actually asked in the post survey the participants, we basically drew up a list of what are the typical things that companies do to countermeasures for insider threat. And we basically asked the users, well, to what degree would, and this was one of the last questions we asked them because it's a little more revealing, but to what degree do these security mechanisms, would it have affected how they behaved? And we did it for the malicious and benign group. And the things that we were looking at for those of you remotely were things like, well, document headers and footers indicating proprietary material. Another one would be pop-up warnings indicating, hey, you're being monitored. Awareness that there's monitoring software on your computer was yet another one. Signing a confidentiality agreement. Being in a public environment while using the laptop. There's a general one that we call just security policy, awareness of there being security policy related to using appropriate use of information. Signing ethics agreements was yet another one. Knowledge of recent violations where people were caught in terms of insider threat was one, and then finally mandatory training. A couple things were interesting. One was the thing that everybody does across the groups was rated the lowest, which was the mandatory training. That's actually, this isn't a conclusive study or anything like that, but it does kind of raise the question of how effective are these things that organizations are doing? I mean, if training is not effective, or do we know how effective it is? I think there's a lot of unanswered questions here that further research could potentially elicit some interesting answers to. The things that ended up being the statistically significant differences were pop-up warnings indicating that you're being monitored. Malicious were much more likely to say that would have affected them. Awareness of monitoring software, that kind of makes sense. And then knowledge of recent information use violations. So all those have potential policy implications in terms of how organizations might want to address the insider threat. So we learned a lot of things from this study. One of the things that was really important was, in a particular where you're dealing with a human experiment type of study, is you get only one chance to do it right, and you don't want to find out halfway through that that your protocol was flawed and there's people were not engaging with their roles. So we did do a lot of piloting of the design before we actually did the experiment, and we found there were some additional things that we had to do to really get them into the role and make sure that they understood their task. And there was some, I think we did about 5 or 6 different dry runs before we actually started collecting data. Of course, in our case, the handing out of a laptop, a special purpose laptop, kind of was an artificiality and the fact that they had to deliver the information on CD introduced some artificialities. The problem with the laptop was they did their work for the experiment on one laptop, and then if they had, one of the things we hypothesized is that they would interleave benign and malicious behavior. Well, they did. They did it on 2 different machines, only one of which we were monitoring. At least anecdotally, that was the answer that we got. So that was, in an ideal world, you would have one laptop for them to do everything, but from a logistical standpoint, we just couldn't do that. Also, in terms of the data analysis, we really, especially with host-based monitoring, we had a very difficult time in separating out what is the user's behavior versus what is the operating system doing on behalf of, or the application doing on behalf of the user. We thought, for example, some of the things that users would do, well, after they do bad stuff, if they're in the malicious condition, they'll delete their cache, they'll remove their history, they'll clear out their cookies. Well, we saw the first two. The cookies, the problem was it was impossible to separate out what the browser is doing as part of its daily maintenance and upkeep. It's actually more than daily, it's constant upkeep versus what was a user-initiated delete of their cookies. And then you have all sorts of stuff, weird stuff with Microsoft Office. It creates temp files all the time and moves stuff around. You open up a PowerPoint file and all the objects in there get blown up into Windows meta files or enhanced meta files in a Windows temp directory. All that looks like file opens, file creations, and it sometimes can be very difficult to tweeze out the human from the machine behavior, but we did spend a lot of time doing that. The other thing is that the host-based monitoring was really nice, but there were some gaps. Another thing we hypothesized would be interesting that malicious users might do is that they might interleave their behavior, but do it not only with you can do it certainly. Okay, you can do it time of good behavior, time of bad behavior, or you can do the behavior at the same time using different browser windows, or simply separate tabs. But unfortunately, with the host-based monitoring, you can't differentiate different process, different windows or different tabs within the same browser. So we couldn't really tell whether they were doing that or not. And then other simple things like we thought searching within a web page would be kind of an interesting thing to see. It's yet another way of focusing down on the information and telling us what they're really interested in trying to get at. But we couldn't observe that. We did feed that information back to the vendor, and we believe they said they would look at trying to address those feature requests. In terms of the data loss, DLP is data loss prevention. That's the host-based monitoring type of host-based monitoring product we used. We also found that out of the box, they tend to filter a lot of data simply because they can't deal with everything that happens. They don't have good analytic techniques for reducing down things for the analyst. So we had to unfilter a lot of stuff that came out of the box in order to see the kinds of things that we need. And finally, one of the things we realized is that, getting back to our central hypotheses, were people predictable in their paths? Well, it really came down to individual users. There were things that were statistically different between the control and the experiment group, but down to the individual, it's hard to predict. If you only look for these three things, you'll detect all the malicious people. In terms of the predictiveness within their group of doing certain things, we found that there's just the human factor. People just do things. They may engage in some of the malicious behaviors that you think you'll see, but they won't predictably engage in just a subset of the ones that you think about. So we think you probably need to, this tells us is that you do need to try to cast a wider net of indicators, which is kind of what we were trying to do with the initial Elicit work was if you have a way of combining evidence and prioritizing things, you can cast a wider net of indicators in terms of things that you look at. That's really it. We have a number of papers that go into the research, both the initial internal Elicit work as well as the work that we did under the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection. And a summary of all this work is actually in the November edition of IEEE Security and Privacy magazine. There's an article that summarizes all this work. for more information. So subject to your questions.